In the first chapter of this course, we are going to talk about evaluation of the position. The correct evaluation of position is very important because it tells us what's the status on the board, whether we are better, worse, or equal. According to that, we find or we formulate a plan of how to continue later on. The evaluation of the position consists of several elements. First one is material balance. We need to see whether we have more or less pieces than our opponent. Second is control over the center. Who has advantage there? Third is strong and weak squares. It is important to identify the weak squares and strong squares in our position, as well as in our opponent's position, so that we know, so that we later on can plan how to exploit them. Third one is open files and diagonals. Who has control over the open files and which files and diagonals are important? Fourth element is activity of the pieces. We need to determine which piece is well placed, which piece is strong, which piece is bad. According to that, our plan will be to either to improve our position of our pieces, to exchange the pieces that our opponent has that are strong, or to chase them away. Fifth element is the safety of the kings. It is important to have the king on a safe place because it can drastically change the outcome of the position or evaluation in general, and that can influence on the plan that we plan to formulate after we came into a conclusion about the evaluation of the position. In our first example, we are going to see the game between Winter William and Alexander Alekhine. We know Alexander Alekhine, he is the ex-world champion. So the game started with white playing d4, to which Alekhine replied with e6. This move e6, the idea of this move is to be more flexible into choosing what kind of setup black will choose after, let's say, c4. He doesn't have to play immediately after c4. He doesn't have to play knight f6. He can play maybe f5, and there is also one variation that goes bishop b4. So this was the flexibility that Alekhine was seeking after playing e6 in the first move, but that also allowed white to choose differently, and after e6 white decided to play e4, and we reached after d5 the French defense. White, being a d4 player, probably wanted to play safe here because he maybe didn't know the opening theory in the French defense, so he immediately took on d5, and after e takes d5 we reached a symmetrical position, very equal one. This is a variation that players that don't have very big ambitions with white usually choose. After e takes d5, white played bishop d3, and black replies with knight c6, attacking the d4 pawn. The game continued knight d2, and then bishop d6, c3. The idea of this move is that white wants to play bishop f4. He wants to trade the dark squared bishops and even further simplify the position. Here, as we can see, usually the light squared bishop, black light squared bishop is bad because the d5 pawn, the fixed pawn in the position, it's on light square. Same goes for white. His dark squared bishop is restricted by the pawn on d4, therefore it's a worse bishop in general, of course, but it's something that we should try to aim to exchange. Black saw white's idea and he played queen h4. The idea of this move is, of course, to prevent that exchange from happening. The queen on h4 is quite unusual, but it's good, well placed, because white cannot chase it away easily, since the knight is on e2 already, and if the knight cannot come to f3, which makes the queen untouchable at the moment. Moves like g3 only weaken white's position. White played knight d2. His idea now is, of course, to play knight f3 and to chase away black queen. But black also was prepared for that, and he played bishop g4, preventing knight f3. Queen c2, and long castle. White played knight f1. This shows that white already has some problems. We are in at the move 9 in the opening, and if white has to play moves like this, then it's not very good. Something is wrong in his position. Of course, it's far from any advantage for black because the position is super symmetrical and equal. The play here is slow. There are no immediate checks or attacks or captures or sacrifices. So white can waste time practically here in these type of positions. Another option for white was to play bishop f5, check, offering a bishop exchange, but that's not good for black to take bishop f5 because of queen f5. So the best move is to play king f8, king b8, and after bishop g4, queen takes g4. Black is better here because white cannot castle, since after castle the knight on e2 will be lost. The pawn on g2 is under attack, so black is the one that has an advantage. As we said, white played knight f1, and black replied with g6. Another option for him was to play knight f6 to develop the pieces in a normal manner, and after bishop e3, rook he8, castle, and to go back with the bishop on d7. The bishop has done his job, so now he goes back. Black is intending to play knight g4. This was one way of playing this position. Black decided to play differently. He played g6, and later we will see what was the idea of this move. Bishop e3, knight g7, castles, and bishop f5. Black has done or has conducted the idea that white wanted to do in the move 5 when he played knight e2. Black is now exchanging his conditionally said bad bishop for the white's good bishop on d3. Since white has placed most of his pawns on dark squares, the light squared bishop is very useful in the white's position, so that's why this exchange favors black. Knight fg3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and black played h6. The idea of this move was to play g5, to play then f5, to play f4, to gain space on the king side. In order to win in such a game where there are no there is no dynamic, there is no dynamic in the center, it's very important to play on flanks and to slowly gain space there. This is what was black's goal with h6 move. White got afraid of that and immediately played f4, which was a first positional mistake that he made in this game. Why a mistake? Because it shuts down the bishop on e3, creates a permanent weakness on the e4 square, and allows black to have a very interesting strong square on f5. We will see that the f5 square, usually the square in front of the opponent's pawn, it's usually quite strong for us. Another option for white was to play queen d2, and after g5, rook d1. If f5, now to play f3. The problem is that f4 is not good for black, since after bishop f2, and if black takes, white takes, black queen on h4 is trapped. White here has a winning position. Of course, black doesn't have to play this idea with g5 and f5, but as an example, this shows that white doesn't have anything to be afraid of. f4 was played, and now black plays queen g4. The queen has done his job on the h4 square, prevented white from uh, exchanging the bishops on f4. So now the queen, black puts his queen on the on light squares with the idea to control or to increase the control over those weak squares that white again weakened with the f2 f4 pawn push. We have to be very careful when pushing the pawns forward because they don't go backwards. Now white has created a potential weakness on e4, which at the moment is not a problem, but in the future can be. After that, white played h3, chasing away the queen, and black returned with the queen on d7. The game continued with rook hf1. The idea of this move is to push f5. That way, white will solve the problem with his bishop on e3, which is now restricted by its own pawns. He will also eliminate the strong square that black has on f5. So this move has an idea. Now we reach the position where black needs to choose a plan. Black needs to find a way how to continue. In order to have a successful plan or to choose the right plan, black needs to evaluate the position. He needs to see where he's standing. Now, if we look at this position, we can see that the first element is material balance. We can see that the material is balanced, so no one has extra material here. Second element is control over the center. We can see that white is controlling the d4 square, the central square, and the e5. It will be very unpleasant for black if white can jump with his knight on e5. So that is what white is controlling. Black is controlling the e4 and the d5 squares. We can conclude here that both players have equal control over the center, so in the first element the situation is equal. In the second element, or the third element practically now, is strong and weak squares. We can see that white does not have a strong square. Maybe the square on e5, but nothing more than that. On the other hand, black has a strong square on e4, which is a weak square for white. Potentially interesting strong square on c4, if the knight can come there. And also, I would say strong square on f5. But at the moment, that's not very clear. It would be great if black knight can come to f5, but at the moment, that's not in black's control. However, we should always take that in count when we are looking at the position, because it can happen. So we can get control over the f5 square or fight for that f5 square. Again, here black doesn't have any tangible advantage. So we can agree that this is also equal element. The fourth element is open files and diagonals. There is only one open file, the E file. None of the players have control over the E file. But we can see that black has only one piece, while white has two minor pieces on that file. So logically, naturally, black should more easily get control over that E file. However, it's not a big advantage because white can place a rook on the e1 square and at least trade everything on along the e file. So black cannot dominate that e file. Fifth element is activity of the pieces. Now we have here the knights. We can see that white knight on e2 not very strong. The knight on g3 also doesn't have a good square where to go. But the knight on g3 is actually protecting the e4 square. Also important thing to notice is that the knight on e2 can go to g1 and to f3 and then to e5. We mentioned that the e5 is potentially strong square for white, and that is where the white would like to see his knight. So he will aim to get there. The bishop on e3 is restricted by the pawns. So at the moment I think that's the worst piece that white has. It looks like another pawn in the position, but that of course can change since the pawn structure on the king side is not fixed and the pawns can move forward. In black's camp we can see that the knight on e7 it's well placed because it can go to f5, possible square for him. Also we can see that the knight on e6 it's not very good because it's restricted by white's pawns, so black will have to find a road for that knight to put him on a better square. This is something that can be our plan in the future because this knight needs to be improved. The bishop on d6 stands well, but it doesn't do much. It is just centralized, controls diagonals, but for the time being it's not very useful. Of course, ideally will be if black can trade the bishop on d6 for white knight and then have more control over the central light squares. Normally here the rooks are equally placed. Maybe the rook on f1 is a little bit better than the rook on h8, but that's not by much. The queens are equally active, so we can say that here both players have equal stance. I mean, the position here is balanced. Safety of the kings. Both kings are safe. Maybe white king is a little bit weaker because of the c3 pawn, but of course that is far from something that black can exploit, since there are plenty of pieces around white king, so white king has nothing to worry about. Now if we look at the position and try to come up with a plan, we can see that the main weaknesses into white's position were the light squares, the e4 f5 squares. f5 is not a weak square for white because it's in our camp, so it's a strong square for black. We can see that white has problems with his knights, and we can see what is white's idea with his last move was to push f4 f5. That is why in this position black played h5. With this move black is aiming to chase away the knight from g3 and to increase the control of the f5 square. With this he will just neutralize completely white's idea to push f4 f5. Knight g1 was played. White also does his idea, does his plan. I mean, he creates a square for his knight on g3 to come to e2 because he anticipates that that knight will be chased. But he also transfers his other knight from e2 to f3 and then to e5 if black allows it. h4, knight 3 e2, knight f5. This is the strong square for the knight, and we can see that now white cannot chase the black knight on f5 easily. Knight f3, f6. With the last move, black defended his weak square on e5. The problem with white is that he cannot defend his weak square on e4 with a pawn. Knight h2. Now the knight maneuvers and tries to get to g4 where he can attack the pawn on f6, but black can defend against it. So he played rook d8. Black is trying to get control over the open file, the only open file on the board. Now he's threatening rook e3, of course. White retreats the bishop, and now black plays rook e6. After rook e6, we can see that black is improving his position. The pawn from h6 came to h4, paralyzing white's pawn structure on the king side. With this, he ensured that the knight on f5 has a good square, strong square, and cannot be chased. With f6, black has defended the e4 square, e5 square, and now he's trying to double up the rooks along the e file with the idea to gain control over that file. Knight g4, rook h e8, rook e d1, and rook 8 to e7. Black is tripling or trying to triple the pieces, and it's worth mentioning here that the best way to triple the pieces, the heavy pieces on an open file, is to put the queen last. That's the most effective way of tripling the pieces. White played king d1. Another option was to play immediately queen f3, but this would transpose to the continuation played in the game. After queen f3, queen e8, the knight on e2 is under attack, so white needs to protect it. One possibility for black is to play king b8. Again, the pawn on d5 is untouchable because of the knight on e2, so let's see if knight c1, knight g3 is possible, and after rook e6, rook takes e6, rook e1, black can play knight e4. We saw how black, with these variations, manages to exploit everything that we saw while we were evaluating the position. Black managed to make a plan, to conduct the plan that exploits all the weaknesses into white's position, and he managed to improve all of his pieces. The game continued with king d1 here immediately, and after queen e8, white played queen f3, something that we saw in the previous variation, but instead of king b8, Alekhine here played knight a5. Now he's aiming to take control over the c4 square. He wants to place the knight there, and suddenly this knight, from being a very useless piece, becomes useful. When the knight comes to c4, he will attack the b2 pawn. He will maybe threaten to take on d2 the bishop. Knight d3, it's also a threat at that point. So the knight suddenly becomes an important piece. For example, white here played b3, but for example, if knight c1, then black can play knight c4, rook e6, rook takes e6, and let's say if queen d5, knight takes b2 check, and after king c2, black can play bishop a3. All black pieces now are employed. All of them are good, all of them have purpose, and black is here much better because also white king is still very much exposed. White king is white's pawn structure on the king is quite bad, and white pieces are passive. In the game, white didn't want to allow that, so he played b3. But this didn't change much the outcome of the black's idea, because this doesn't stop knight c4. The thing is that after knight c4, white cannot take the knight, because after knight takes, then queen a4 check, king c1, bishop a3 check, king b1, rook b6, and the game will be soon over. White is simply, or will get checkmated in no time. So that's why after knight c4, white played bishop c1. But now, as we said, the knight from c4 can come to e3, and this is what was black's idea. Knight e3 check, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, knight takes e3, and rook takes e3. Queen d5, it's not possible because white loses the knight on f2, so white played queen f2. Black has total domination over the only open file. He exchanged two of his knights, but those were strong knights, but he got a much better position. Now even the white king is very unsafe, because there are no pieces that protect him. Queen b5. Queen d3 is a threat that will win a piece. So the only move for white is knight c1. However, here, after this move and long maneuvering, black wins his first material. He wins a pawn with rook c3. The game continued rook e7. White is already in a difficult position. After rook e7, black played bishop e7. Faster way to win was to play bishop a3. And after, let's say, king d2, queen c6, threatening rook c2. Rook e8 check, king d7, queen e3 because there is nothing better, and rook c2. King e1, bishop b4 check, king d1, rook d2. Queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, king d2, and king takes the rook on e8. Black is of course completely winning. After rook e7, Alekhine took the rook on e7, still with a winning position. He has more material and better placed pieces, so absolutely nothing to worry about. This is like a human way of playing. There is no need to risk to give an effective checkmate. It's better to play it safe and to just win the point and win the game. Queen e1, king d7. The rook on c3 is untouchable. Okay, black can take it, but then he will lose the rook on f1. So white played f5. After f5, black played rook e3. Again, white cannot take the rook on e3 because he will lose the rook on f1 and then the pawn on f5. So queen f2, g5, rook e1, rook e4, rook takes e4, d takes e4, king d2. Black played bishop d6, threatening bishop f4 check and queen f5. Black is already pawn up. He has better pawn structure. Black has possibility to take the f5 pawn, the d4 pawn, because those are weak pawns into white's position. So it's just a matter of time when white's position collapses. After king c2, black played bishop f4. Now the pawn on f5 will be lost. Also e3, e2 might be devastating for white. Simply after queen f5, the game will be over. That's why here white decided to resign. This was an excellent example of how equal position with the right plan can be improved and brought into a winning position. Alekhine here made a correct evaluation. He realized that the position is equal. He realized that he needs to improve the position of his pieces. He realized that he needs to take control over the important squares in the position and managed to outplay his opponent.